Hi, it's Dwyer. Money1776.com, a free site. Always 1776.com, a free site. Today is July 5th, 2025. Nothing I say in this video should be construed as investment advice. I want everyone to do their own due diligence. I'm just sharing what I believe, what I am considering, what I might be pursuing, right? Your assumption should be that all of the stocks that I discuss are stocks I might own, and that the reason I own them is to make a profit. Trust no one. Don't trust me. I want everyone here to think for themselves. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, let me just say that people have agendas, including me, right? I believe folks are being sold a false batch of goods, right? It's up to you to figure out whether the people selling you this stuff are well intentioned, right? As longtime viewers know, I'm not a fan of tariffs. I wasn't a fan of tariffs before the current administration. I'm not a fan of tariffs now, right? Just understand, to me, tariffs are the government interfering with consensual trade deals between two trading parties, right? To me, tariffs are just another tax that the government imposes on its own citizens, right? You're paying a tax. Understand, at one point there was talk about Amazon and Walmart, two of the biggest retailers in the United States, actually listing the tariff, the tax that you were going to be paying and how it impacted the price they were going to charge you. Our federal government stepped in. Some, I'll use the word, threats were made. These retailers who don't need to have the federal government against them backed away, right? But just understand, we live in a world where, you're getting taxed, right? It's a tax on imports. And of course, they call it something else. If they called it an import tax, people would be offended. They call it a tariff, right? You're supposed to believe that the other guy is paying in the transaction, even though you're the one who's actually buying the goods and paying the extra. Understand how bad tariffs are. And I'm just going to talk another minute on tariffs. Tariffs are so bad that they lead to financial distortions. Because of tariffs, you then have entrepreneurs in the United States who decide, you know what, China can beat us on price, might be able to beat us on quality. But with this tariff, we can compete. We can actually win on price. So you have businesses that should never see the light of day suddenly spring up. They're uncompetitive globally, but they work with the tariff. They become dependent on the tariff for their survival. Capital gets misallocated toward these businesses. In other words, a tariff's such a bad idea. Not only are you paying more for foreign goods, but capital is getting diverted toward uncompetitive businesses when it would be better served being invested in globally competitive businesses, right? Well, let's talk about some further distortions. Then I'm going to get into two of my heroes, right? Jim Chanos, who I've followed for years, and Michael Saylor. But let's continue on in terms of talking about distortions. Let me just say, Robert Schiller, years ago, talked about how housing long term doesn't really beat inflation by that much. Right? In other words, housing really didn't have that big a real rate of return. Now, you understand, as things are, because of how we tax things, right? Prices are distorted. The government's actually floating housing, right? It's not a free market. You understand that. Well, let me just point out that it's even more distorted than that. I talk with people my age, folks who I went to school with, and they were firmly of the mindset. This was the consensus thought that buying a house was a good thing. You wanted to buy a house at any price, right? Because housing was going to go up long term. So, of course, you had people who could have been entrepreneurs, people who could have taken chances and actually invested in startups and perhaps made a huge profit, right? I spoke with many people years ago who thought Amazon was a great idea, right? But they were saddled with, let's say, $800,000 mortgages at the time, right? That since then now are up around, 1.4, $1.5 million if they're buying houses today, right? People took themselves out of the game. They could have rented. Right now, renting where I am in San Jose is cheaper than owning a home. They could have rented a spot in a cultural hotbed, New York City, San Francisco, West Hollywood. They could have rented in some place where they'd have memories of being young and hitting restaurants and hitting clubs and some kind of vibrant nightlife instead of being in El Sobrante or some suburb way out, far away from where the action was. Right? But the home idea was so front and center because their parents bought a home and saw it increase in value. Folks, now we're realizing that a lot of the economic numbers were distorted because our government, which now has a $37 trillion debt, and I haven't even gotten to the derivative debt that's out there that's far higher, right? Was spending money it didn't have. Understand, the currency was delinked from gold. And so the currency was just being printed without any relationship to hard assets. Right? So your parents lived in a world that you don't live in. Right? Also understand the baby boomers had one-off demographics. Right, folks? Demographics have changed. In other words, market conditions have changed. So when I'm talking to someone my age, and I'm hearing about them doing the right thing and all this other nonsense, I realize they have no idea what a free market looks like. None of us have any idea what the market would have looked like if our government was running balanced budgets. Right? People my age are getting laid off, folks, because AI is that disruptive. I don't care what people tell you. Right? Many of my backgrounds are created by old AI, right? I'm just telling you, there was a time where I would hire people to do things. Right now, forget it. I can use AI to do so much that the idea of actually having a research clerk doesn't work for me. And I'm someone who won an appeal in a case where my research clerk, my assistant, actually wrote the brief. And he had to explain to me the legal grounds for the brief. In other words, I leaned heavily on people who were working for me. And now, thanks to AI, my productivity has jumped to where I don't really have to. The point I'm making is simply, folks, the world changes so fast, it's head spinning. You can't blindly follow an older generation who did things based on the market conditions that existed and the taxation scheme that existed at the time that they made their economic decisions. Right? It might shock some people, but believe it or not, at one point, the highest federal marginal tax rate was 94%. Look it up. Right? You'd be surprised. Kennedy cut taxes in the early 60s. Look at what he cut them to. Right? They're high by today's standards. Back then, it was mind-blowing. Right? You go back far enough in history, you'll find that there were generations who weren't paying any income tax. Right? You can't follow what great-grandpa did or great-grandmom did or what your own parents did. Well, let's talk about this video, the subject matter of this video. And I'm in a weird spot here because Jim Chanos is someone I followed for years. I remember when Chanos took the position that Enron was a fraud because of off-the-book entities. Right, folks? Enron was huge at the time. Huge at the time. Enron's motto at the time was why ask why? Right? They were advertising on the biggest events. You'd be watching TV, it would be some big show, and Enron would have ads. Right? Jeff Skilling was supposed to be some kind of genius. Right? Ken Lay was viewed as one of these great businessmen. Off at the side, right? I mean, literally, off at the side was Jim Chanos and his group saying, hey, you can't trust their numbers. Chanos was right. Right? Skilling went to jail. These off the balance sheet economic entities were hiding a lot of losses. I know there's a group out there that doesn't believe in short selling. You got to be kidding. What goes up can come down. Why shouldn't people who are accurately telling you to short a stock and who are shorting the stock as it is dropping, why shouldn't that be fully embraced? Isn't the goal of a market to have accurate prices? Isn't the price really a disclosure of information? How the market is valuing things. How can the market create the proper price if we aren't allowing short selling? Right? Let me also say this too. You don't have to agree with me in this video. Right? YouTube can be interactive. There's a comment section. If you're someone who's against short selling, I know some of these entrepreneurs are shaken up over short selling. I understand many short selling people have been wrong at times. That's why you have short squeezes. Right? We're all, taking risks and predicting prices. Well, just understand, Jim Chanos took the risk and he was right. Let me also say, too, that Chanos talks about how in the late 70s, early 80s, he had blue collar jobs. Then when he went to Wall Street, and we forget this, because of course by the late 80s there were movies like Wall Street with Michael Douglas that made you think that Wall Street was always some glamorous type existence. Chanos talks about how when he first started working on Wall Street, he took a pay cut from the blue collar job he had. Right? Understand, from 68 to 82, the stock market was relatively flat. Right? I can tell you, I had a college interview. Some Wall Street guy was interviewing me. I, went there after a day at high school, and, the building was mostly deserted. It didn't look glamorous. Right? I remember I spoke with my parents before I went to the interview, and they were worried for my safety. My family viewed Wall Street as dodgy. That was in the early 80s, right? Well, let me just say this. I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist, right? People need to know that up front. I have a Substack page on crypto. It's DWYER70905.substack.com, right? Give it a look. I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist. I believe some, and that's the operative word, not all, not most, not many, but some other coins, what we now call altcoins, that altcoin word will fade over time, will surpass Bitcoin's rate of return, right? I invite people to look up some of the recent interviews on YouTube featuring Tom Lee, right? Tom, L-E-E. And some of the recent actions he's taken, right? He is a great investor, right? Let me also say this too. When you start following investors, you understand many of them disagree with each other. You heard me mention I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist. Max Kaiser, great investor, he would cringe at that, right? I know, coming from a blue-collar neighborhood, that there's this mythology out there that all of the great investors all agree with each other. Not even close, right? Take Bitcoin. Understand, you have, people like Jamie Dimon. Not that he's a great investor, but he runs JP Morgan, right? Who at one point, didn't like Bitcoin at all. You have, by contrast, Paul Tudor Jones, who called Bitcoin the best horse in the race, right? Let's just say the opinions vary. You shouldn't view investing as us versus them, right? Sometimes you hear the craziest ideas imaginable, and those ideas become the status quo, right? I was once in court. My side had to pay the other side some money. I sent over the payment in PayPal. Understand, I work in Silicon Valley. I was at Santa Clara Superior Court in front of a judge who would later become a presiding judge. And while people, let's just say, while many were using PayPal, the other attorney accused my side of not paying. I had the PayPal information with me. I took it out to show the judge. The judge didn't know what PayPal was. Right? The judge said, hey, Mr. Dwyer, you need to make this payment, or you're going to be in big trouble, basically. Words to that effect. And I was thinking, how's this possible? I made the payment. Why doesn't this guy claim the payment? Right? And the idea of PayPal was just preposterous. I had to explain to the judge, that we sent the money by email, and the judge started laughing. The idea was so preposterous. Well, think about the people involved in PayPal. Two of them, Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, have gone on to make billions of dollars in other ventures. Right? Now let's talk about Jim Chanos' disagreement with Michael Saylor, and I'm going to pick a side here because I think it's important to lead people in the right direction. Have a video that's going to be online for however long YouTube decides to keep this video online, and have people able to refer back to it, especially if Bitcoin goes where I think it's going to go. Now, just understand, MicroStrategy, today is the 5th of July. MicroStrategy, as of June 30th, had roughly $64 billion worth of Bitcoin. Right? Understand that MicroStrategy is up 210% over the last year. Bitcoin, by contrast, its main asset, is only up 80%. So Jim Chanos, and again, he's a hero of mine. Right? I know in business school they teach you about these guys. You know, it's ridiculous to think that they don't teach you about the great investors, at least of your era, before business school. You know, I didn't go to business school. Right? Understand, I know about Jim Chanos because I was alive during the Enron era. Because I thought, this guy's interesting. I was learning about short selling, and I thought, let me look up the great short sellers. Right? And of course, Chanos, as I mentioned, was right on Enron. So Chanos has a point. He asks a basic question. If MicroStrategy's software business isn't generating that much money, and if its main asset is worth $64 billion, I'm paraphrasing Chanos, right? I'm throwing in the numbers. Then how is it possible that MicroStrategy itself could be worth in excess of the main asset it holds? Shouldn't MicroStrategy be worth $64 billion plus whatever the value is of its other business offerings? Right? Isn't that the actual value of the company? Shouldn't the company be measured by its net asset value? Right, folks? That's a powerful argument. It's a mathematical argument. Right? If I'm holding $100 and that's what my business has, why isn't my business worth $100? Right? How could it be worth a multiple of the $100? Right? Now, Michael Saylor has responded by saying Jim Chanos doesn't understand our business model. Right? Saylor's basically pointed to the past growth of Bitcoin, and he points out that they're using leverage. Right? They're borrowing money to buy more Bitcoin, and that has a value that should be added to the holding of their Bitcoin. Chanos has come back, and understand, these are, two esteemed guys. Right? Saylor has been a CEO for years. Right? Chanos, of course, as I mentioned earlier, has been on Wall Street since at least the early 80s. Well, just to understand, Chanos calls what Saylor has to say financial gibberish. He further calls Saylor more of a salesman than anything else. Right? Let me just make a point here. And I know the math is on Chanos' side. But I actually believe in Saylor's position. Folks, understand the ability to buy Bitcoin on leverage, particularly the cheap leverage, that MicroStrategy, now called Strategy, is able to do so because Strategy, of course, is issuing preferred stock, right? It's getting money from investors that it's using to buy Bitcoin, that it hopes will kick off more than the interest it pays to its investors, right? So it has its own internal way to borrow money, right? So it has some protection because of the way its preferred stock is structured, right? It has some protection from uncertain credit markets, right? President Trump wants Powell, the Fed chairman, to, cut the federal funds rate. Um, you know, the stock market is overinflated right now. Uh, there might be an uptick in inflation. Powell has to be mindful of that. Powell has been less than definitive on his plans to cut interest rates, even though much of the world, at least a lot of Europe, has cut rates to the point where Switzerland has a zero interest rate right now. Right? So understand, strategy is somewhat immunized, protected from all of that, because it has a mechanism by which it can get money from preferred stockholders that it then uses on Bitcoin. Right? Well, what I want people to think about is the future. Bitcoin is capped at 21 million. Understand there are many, Tom Lee, who I mentioned earlier, who believes that right now you're in the mid 90s or so in terms of a comparison between the internet, how many people were using the internet in, let's say, 1996, and how many people own Bitcoin right now, right? The feeling is that Bitcoin is still in the early innings. We're not even in the fourth or fifth inning, right? Bitcoin, of course, has increased in value, I believe, on average. And don't get me wrong, we've had major volatility in the past. But on average, Bitcoin has increased something like 30% per year. Right now, Strategy's premium, and I know Jim Chanos disagrees with this completely, is really based on the fact that since it uses leverage, since it borrows money to buy Bitcoin, today, while it has $64 billion worth of Bitcoin, tomorrow it's going to be able to grow that Bitcoin hoard much faster than it would without its borrowing mechanisms. Right? Also, if you believe that Bitcoin is going to continue to increase, that Bitcoin hasn't even hit its sweet spot yet, because before you were dealing with people who didn't understand Bitcoin. You were dealing with Bitcoin as a standalone new product that was unrecognizable. Now we understand the value of cryptocurrency. Now you have an entire ecosystem of cryptos doing different roles. Now you have the Paul Tudor Joneses, the Robert Kiyosakis. I'm naming some early adopters of Bitcoin, right? Guys who have financial paths. So you could see the financial success they've had, right? People who you understand are not rookies in making financial investments, right? Robert Kiyosaki, of course, wrote Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Paul Tudor Jones was an institution on Wall Street for years, right? They're in Bitcoin. And of course, we all understand Fidelity is now, doing a spot Bitcoin ETF. BlackRock is doing a spot Bitcoin ETF. ARK. You have all these financial institutions doing, ETFs involving Bitcoin. And of course, you have the President of the United States, Donald Trump, into cryptocurrency. Right? So just understand, while it's true, if you look at it like Jim Chanos does, $64 billion worth of Bitcoin here, $64 billion worth of Bitcoin here, both should grow the same amount over time, all things created equally. So if you believe Bitcoin is going to grow by 30% annually, then they should both grow. There shouldn't be a premium being paid to what's called a Bitcoin treasury company, right? That's what strategy is, to, hold your Bitcoin for you. Right? Let me point out, too, there's another group out there. We'll call them the old guard, who believe not your keys, not your crypto. They're concerned about Bitcoin treasury companies. Why should I have somebody else holding my Bitcoin? Can I get a cold storage wallet? There's several quality cold storage wallets out there, and own the Bitcoin myself. Right? Why do I want to trust a counterparty? Why should I, have counterparty risks? Why do I need a strategy to hold my Bitcoin when I can hold it? So as Bitcoin appreciates in value, I make money. Let me point out, too, that the issue hits home for me because I had Bitcoins on Celsius. And of course, that turned out to be a racket. Let's just say I lost a bunch, right? I also had some altcoins on a foreign exchange. This has happened to me twice. This was in the early days of crypto, where the exchanges suddenly, one, reduced the amount I had and claimed they had been hacked. The other just disappeared. Right? So I understand the arguments. I've lived through the arguments. Right? But let me say this. If you are willing to have somebody else hold your crypto, and understand that does carry counterparty risk. Let me point out that, Strike.me, for example, Jack Mallers' company, wants people to trust them. Right? It goes against the ethos of Satoshi Nakamoto's vision of decentralized finance, where you're holding your own crypto. Right? But understand, part of the market doesn't want to be involved in holding their own crypto, because keeping track of your passwords, that's a problem. Having, let's say, $100,000 on a cold storage wallet that you're keeping is a bit of a problem. Right? I can tell you where I live, I had some stepdaughters who were teenagers, and no matter what I said to them, they would have friends over. And, let's just say, you don't want to be in a situation where, someone could easily, see that you have a wallet someplace and an electric, ledger or treasure, and grab it and, be off with your crypto. Of course, savvy crypto people know that you need a password to get into the wallet, right? And as long as you keep your, 24-word list, you can recreate the wallet. But let's just say Many people don't want the burden of having to hold their own crypto, right? So there is a market for Bitcoin treasury companies. Let me make an obvious point here. There are many cryptos who are going to end up being on the balance sheet of these companies, right? This is a different world than an ETF world, right? Well, let me just say the $64 billion, right? If you believe it's going to get to 70, then 80, just understand the Saylor part of the ledger is going to increase faster than the Chanos part of the ledger, because the Saylor part of the ledger is leveraged. So he's going to be borrowing money to buy more Bitcoin. Now, if you believe that Bitcoin is heavily discounted today, right? You have different groups out there. You have one group that hears that Bitcoin's going for over $100,000, and they're thinking, what the hell is going on? Some software program is, going for $100,000, right? $100,000. That's ridiculous, right? My dad, if he were still alive, I have no doubt that's what he would be thinking, right? You have another group who understands only 21 million Bitcoin are ever going to be made. They're looking at Bitcoin as being used in commerce. They're looking at the world economy. They're looking at the competitors to Bitcoin, including our rapidly depreciating fiat dollar, right? They're looking at debt levels on sovereign balance sheets, and they're thinking to themselves, wow, how in debt is the United Kingdom? How in debt is Spain? How in debt is France? This is a global epidemic, right? Within the last 24 hours, I was reading an article on South Africa. Folks, there's an emotional tug and pull all over the globe, right? So let me just point out, because Saylor is using leverage, he's going to end up with more Bitcoin, as well as substantially more risk than Chanos's net asset value analysis, where, Chanos is just equating $64 billion worth of Bitcoin with $64 billion worth of Bitcoin that strategy has. He's not thinking of the future. He's not, assuming that Bitcoin is going to rapidly rise and that the price of Bitcoin today might greatly understate what its value is going to be in 12 months, 18 months, 5 years from now. Understand, too, there are those who believe, let me raise my hand, that the volatility of Bitcoin in the past is not going to be its volatility in the future, because it's a maturing market with far less uncertainty. Now that so many institutional investors, repeat financial players, long-time experienced investors are entering the game, and now that we have regulatory certainty, right? Let me also say, too, that while there's several companies now that are Bitcoin treasury companies, right? Metaplanet comes to mind. Saylor's group has a huge head start. And understand, many of these other companies don't have the access to capital that strategy has. Just be aware of the fact that, that factors in to the stock price. So there is a gap right now between the net asset value of strategy and its stock price right now. I believe that gap over time is going to disappear as Bitcoin jumps in value. But I need for people to understand the heavy risk involved. You heard me earlier say I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist, right? I believe there are other coins that are going to be used as, methods of payment, right? They're going to cut into Bitcoin's thunder. But I believe the cryptocurrency market in general is still in its very early innings. Very early innings, right? And, as it gets adopted, right, the values of several cryptos are going to jump, right? So, what I want people to do is to look at Saylor's business model. Look hard at his preferred stock. Some of it's non-cumulative. In other words, I can just decide I'm not paying a dividend, and I don't owe you that missed dividend in the future, right? The devil is in the fine print. Understand too, I know one of the preferreds on strategy pays, I believe, 8%. I think another one pays 10%. That sounds high, but it's not really, right? What I want people to do is to look at mortgage rates right now, right? And that's for real estate, which has been with us far longer than digital assets, right? Let me also say too that Bitcoin has a special place in the crypto universe because it's the first, right? I still talk with people, some of my good friends, who have little awareness that there are other digital assets, right? So what you have here is you have a Xerox situation where people refer to Bitcoin and they just mean digital assets in general. They don't understand that Bitcoin's just one, right? Just like Xerox was just one manufacturer, right? So I remember being in an office and someone said, hey, can you Xerox this for me? It became a verb, right? And you thought to yourself, wow, this is like Coke. You go to a restaurant and you say, hey, I'll have a Coke, because you think that's the drink. You don't realize it's just one brand, that you could get a cola by saying, hey, I'll take a cola, right? But no, you say, hey, I'll take a Coke, right? And understand, if the person, the server says to you, we don't sell Coke, for probably 95%, I'm just making up a number, they would say, okay, then I'll take a Pepsi, right? The assumption is that, you have one or the other. Well, let me just say, Bitcoin's going to have that status for several years, right? People are going to learn about, crypto. When they hear the prices for crypto, they always want to know the Bitcoin price. And then a couple others, right? Ethereum, Solana, etc. And so understand, Bitcoin has first mover status. And it's going to have first mover status for some time. If people are going to start to put a big part of their life savings into digital assets, they're going to hear about some other digital assets, right? Caspa and stuff like that. And they're going to say, oh, no, I don't know much about that. If offered the opportunity to do Bitcoin, right? That's what they're going to gravitate to. You know that. So Saylor has a huge first mover status among Bitcoin treasury companies. And he has the funding apparatus that most of these Bitcoin treasury companies don't have in-house. right? Also, I mentioned Meta Planet earlier. I'm sure a lot of people are looking at this video and they're saying, Meta what? You can imagine name recognition matters when you're borrowing money, right? Saylor could walk into a bank. People are going to recognize him. They're going to know of strategy. They'll be more inclined to take a risk lending him money than they would other companies. So let me just say, this is a unique situation where I'm going to disagree with Jim Chanos, right? I do believe the name recognition, the fact that Saylor is borrowing money to accumulate his Bitcoin hoard, the fact that the average price of Bitcoin that Saylor has paid historically is lower than the current market price of Bitcoin, right? The fact that Saylor already, has a head start that's going to be insurmountable, quite frankly, on most of the market. In other words, if I'm thinking to myself, wow, a spot Bitcoin ETF is too conservative because they're not buying up all the Bitcoin that exists right now, which I consider to be woefully undervalued, right? And keep in mind, that's the view of Pantera Capital, right? One of the United States' most successful, investment funds, right? If that's my thought process, that he who grabs the most Bitcoin early wins. Well, Saylor has the capability to grab far more Bitcoin than a company that isn't using leverage in the same way. And of course, Saylor is the one with, a lot of Bitcoin, $64 billion worth of Bitcoin, which nobody else has as a treasury, a Bitcoin treasury company, right? To me, the question to ask is, does that warrant the premium Saylor's market valuation is getting over the value of its assets? I believe the answer to that is yes. We can debate it. I'm expecting the gap between the market valuation of strategy and the market valuation of its current holdings to dissipate over time, right? Saylor himself made an interesting statement once. He said, look, if, a country started to print fiat to buy Bitcoin, that country would be ahead of everyone else, right? Maybe some countries doing that. But just understand, Bitcoin has a hard cap, 21 million. That's it, right? It's Saylor who has to jump on most in the Bitcoin treasury market, and that's worth a lot. So pay attention to this argument. It's going to be ongoing. Clearly, if Bitcoin dips in value, if we start questioning, as we have in the past, its viability, right? My opinion could change based on changed facts. Let me close with this story. Had a client. We had a one-off case. It was a divorce case. His wife was the breadwinner of the family, right? So we fought in court and we won. There was a prenup in the case, but we still were able to get a nice little chunk of money. So he and I were leaving court. This was his one lifeline to change his life, right? His, marriage was over. He had gotten the divorce. He had gotten the payout. He wasn't going to get another payout from this woman, right? We got a lump sum, right? So he and I had a conversation. And at the time, Bitcoin was under pressure. I forget how much it was worth, but it was worth less than $15,000. And we were talking, and he had some ideas where he was thinking that he was going to move to a cheaper state, right? Because California is expensive. And I said to him, I said, hey, well, why don't you put some of this money in Bitcoin? What's the harm? Right? Now, keep in mind, I'm a speculator, right? I'm a speculator who has lost, crypto in bankruptcies, right? I had crypto invested in BlockFi, for example, Celsius. Um, I told you about, a couple of exchanges that, took some of my crypto. So I'm an investor who, takes risks. So I said to him at the time, I said, look, why not put at least some of the money in Bitcoin if in fact Bitcoin is a life changer, right? Buying a Bitcoin or two here, with some of the money would, could set you up, right? And you know the rest. He looked at me. It was too much risk for him, right? Had he bought a couple of Bitcoin, he'd be sitting on $200,000 just off that portion, right? But it was too much for him because Bitcoin was up and down. And of course, he was afraid. I also had another guy who works in tech, who was my client, and we were talking about Bitcoin. And he just flatly said to me, hey man, you can't invest in Bitcoin. He said, you understand that quantum is going to take out Bitcoin, right? So, of course, he had me completely afraid. I didn't sell my Bitcoin because of anything he said, but, understand there's that quantum risk. Let me point out that there have been developments. There are quantum resistant cryptocurrencies right now, right? But just understand the risk with Bitcoin is that real. There are no certainties, right? But if you are a risk taker and you're not afraid of investing with a company that's, first off, holding the Bitcoin, right? There's major counterparty risk, right? If you're not afraid of them having your keys, if you're not afraid of them using leverage, them using leverage to buy more Bitcoin, right? If you're not afraid of possible taxation, if you're not concerned with the risk of a change in corporate ownership, right? Saylor deciding, hey, that's it for me, right? I've seen great businessmen change their lives. Steve Ballmer right now owns the Los Angeles Clippers. He's no longer with Microsoft, right? Guys do retire. Guys do give up the CEO position and have, a more nebulous, chairmanship that, is more undefined. If there's a change in corporate ownership, if there is some kind of Enron fraud where the numbers aren't what's in the accounting records, right? You could lose it all. Be careful out there. But if you're a risk taker, just understand strategy's taking the risk. Because they're taking the risk and because they have a greater chance of a bigger reward, I believe they are entitled to a premium over the value of their holdings. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comments section of this YouTube video. Let me also say too, I encourage everyone to look into the background of Jim Chanos, look into the background of the people I mentioned, Paul Tudor Jones, Robert Kiyosaki, Michael Saylor, Tom Lee, who I mentioned. Get your feel for this crypto market, because quite frankly, it's one of the most important markets of our lifetimes. Those are my views. I look forward to yours in the comments section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.